producing textile and ask them to use the natural material. But my approach is, if we and every one of us, which actually using the material and using the waste, using the material and the textile, if we choose natural material, then eventually those companies that producing the product, they shift to the natural products. So every one of us can change that. And I think that's the the best approach and most practical way, because the companies that producing the product, they they want to satisfy the need of their customers. And if
Hmm.
the customers change their need and change shift the way they are thinking, then they naturally will change. But if the customers want a particular product, and then we go and talk to the company and they say, okay, use natural fiber instead of that, they definitely will not change that, because for them cost is very important, availability and speed, and the customer need.
Mm, I can understand that. So I'm wondering, in that case, let's say if there's a company that is adamant about using these synthetic fibers, at least for now, because it's what their customers would like, is there any way that soil regeneration can eliminate the presence of microfibers around us? Because seeing as it's almost infiltrated into everything we've had, and like I've mentioned before, it does lead to illnesses over time, like cancers and Parkinson's and the rest. Is there any way that soil regeneration has proven to start to eliminate the presence of these synthetic materials in our foods and in our nature?
Yeah, I think definitely it can be eliminated, but it take time. And even if, for example, we stop using it now, so it take times to everything go back to the normal. So that's what we done to the environment and planet, and that's a reality. But the important aspect is that if we stop now, it can be actually coming back much faster compared to, for example, we continue the same for another 50 or 100 years and then stop. So that's the effect. For example, in the area of the soil, if we from now start to, for example, change the way we are approaching to the soil and agriculture, then in next 40 or 50 years everything will back to normal. But if we continue the same and then we want to stop it in next 10 years, then we have to do it for another 100 years. So it's actually sooner is better. So that's the important part that we every one of us need to be realized. So maybe the issue is not that big at this stage from, for example, our individual perspective. But if we don't change our action now, then reversing the damage will be much harder and more difficult.
I can actually completely relate to what you're saying because even in my own project, I work in the Sahel region, and a lot of the land you're just dealing with dust. It's not soil anymore. So, although of course some species can survive in such situations, to make dust into soil again is a completely different process to try to rejuvenate um, unorganic soil. That's how I see it. But then maybe I'll
Yeah,
check into
exactly.
this with you
and
later.
and and on that, no, is
Mm,
exactly, and on that, so basically that's the issue is happening everywhere. So now we are slightly shifting toward the soil, which is, I think, it's reasonable for today discussion. So for example, in Australia now, two-thirds of the farming lands is actually degraded, and this organic content in them is just below 1%, which is a very dangerous area, because the minimum organic content that required to be in the soil is 3%. So it shows that we use the agricultural land in a bad way, and we cannot produce good quality food now. So that's the issue. That's the changing it and bringing back to the normal. Then it's take time and it need a new effort and new way of thinking in that.
exactly. And I wanted to even expand on that because on the topic of especially when it comes to waste of companies dumping a lot of their products in landfills, and that gets transferred and it does destroy the soil. Is there anything about soil degradation that you know that isn't publicly put on the media or isn't spoken about as much?
Yeah, I think the issue of the soil, and two things I think I need to mention it here. One of them is, as you mentioned, effect of the waste material. So everybody thinking when we put the waste material in the soil and then cover it up, it's go away and it doesn't harm us anymore. But those waste material is actually start to degrading in there. And when the degradation happen, is actually we are producing carbon dioxide and methane, which is the greenhouse gas, and we are actually increasing the global warming. So that's one of the effect. But also, when the rain is coming and the water, all the toxic material which was in the waste, or after the degradation of them is producing, is actually by the water, rainwater washed away, and it's going to the water bodies, and or in, for example, it's going into the rivers and oceans, and from there is actually again affecting our food chain, because it's going either to the ocean or it's going to the rivers and going to the farmland. So that's one of the issue there. But also another thing that recently, because I'm following this movement of the safe soil movement, and myself also, I didn't know the big issue in the agricultural soil, because I was in the area of the material and waste, but I never thought that the soil is in this danger and in this issue. And to whoever I talk with, they also didn't know. So that's, I think, the big issue, that nobody in the media or nobody in the community, they don't talk about the soil issue and how bad it is, and the issue that, for example, in next 50 years maybe we don't have enough food to
Mm.
uh, produce, or the capability to produce food. So I think that these two is the big issue, that there is a lack of awareness about it.
You know, the first point you made as well was pretty amazing to me because I when the landfill material is dumped. I never thought of that before because you know everyone in the media will tell you that oh global warming comes from cows or it comes from your carbon footprint. And one thing I'd like to mention here, which is quite controversial to some, is that I feel as though your carbon footprint is important, but we have so much focus on what we do individually that we're not seeing our impact as a group and as the human population. For example, we have the biggest carbon sinks in the world, which are blue whales or whales in general, forests, but we continue to deforest in huge amounts of rates. We lose like football pitches of the Amazon every single day. And whales are the most endangered species, and they are the biggest stores of carbon on this earth. If we're talking mammals or just animals in general, they're the biggest store of carbon, but they're going extinct. So it is very important to emphasize how we impact the planet, but then I want this to also be a moment for all of us to recognize how we can save what already exists, because that's what stores the most carbon. That's what saves the soil. Ancient forests matter more than replanting what was lost.
Mhm.
You should still replant, but then always make sure you have the mind of a conservationist rather than someone who's trying to restore. That's my point. And thank you for that as well, because I did learn a lot from those points you've made.
No, it's nothing.
So, one thing I'd also like to know is going back to the cultural impacts. Have you seen? I'm sure you're familiar with the Miyawaki method in Japan for creating microforests.
Mhm.
So, planting, for those of
Yes.
you who don't know, is planting seedlings quite close together because it's in the fight for light. Plants grow quite fast, and you can end up with a fully grown forest within a year or two. And I was wondering if you've seen that culture maintained. or you've seen perhaps manufacturers donate some of their income to projects such as that? Or is the culture of reforestation or replanting in general declined from your experience?
No, I think they still continue the same. And very interestingly, they have a very interesting point that in any manufacturing companies, when they want to, for example, create a new factory or a new, for example, plant, so they have a ratio that based on the, for example, the size of their factory, they have to create, for example, this ratio of that as a forest or as a tree. So for example, some of my work was in the steel making, and the steel making is the most polluted industry in the world, and they create a lot of carbon footprint. But when in the Japan you go to the actually plants, at the first you're thinking that you are going to the forest. So because it's all over that, is actually they are creating and then in the middle of the steel making site. And I think that's very interesting power and point. And some other countries also start to adapting that. So of course we have the industry, we have to create products, we have to, for example, create a steel. But always we need to think, okay, in that, how we can change it, how we can at least reduce the effect or reduce the amount of the carbon emission. And I think those, as you mentioned, the microforest creation or the forest around the factories or around the industrial development is actually changing the effect, not only from the carbon point of view, from the environment aspect, but also from the human experience. Because imagine you are going to the a steel factory, which is a very harsh environment, but every day you are passing through a jungle and going to that. So it's a completely different experience for the human as well.
It is great because it also preserves the biodiversity in the area, and so animals can cross, because there's a lot of focus nowadays on pathways for animals to be able to migrate from, let's say, one side of the forest to another. And by putting in your factory or whatever structure you have in the center of that, you can still preserve it. They just go on top. Any animal
Yes.
can go on top. And I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but when I was younger, about 10, I went to Kuala Lumpur. Now, part of their airport is actually in the middle of what was a forest before. So when you look up and there's clear glass, you can see monkeys swinging, and it's really lovely to see.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but so yes, I guess the message we get from this is that it's very good to integrate yourself within the environment. It doesn't always have to be forest on one end and you're separated from it. You can enter it, you can experience it without negatively affecting it. And so your point about companies goes to my last question, which is the fact that we've mentioned before that if we want companies or manufacturers to start using biodegradable products, such as natural fibers instead of synthetic ones, the change would actually have to come from the customer's needs, first of all. So I'm wondering, is there any way in which customers are encouraged to change their beliefs on climate change through the support of the manufacturers, or are they even told by the companies that they serve to try recycling the final products they use? And I'll give an example if my question's a bit convoluted. Let's say I have this pen here and I manufacture this pen. Are there any policies in place for me to encourage you as the customer to recycle this pen, and not just me recycling the package I put this in? Because it's one thing for me to recycle anything I used to make this pen, but it's another thing if you as the customer takes the initiative to recycle the pen once you've finished with it.
Mhm.
Does this
Yeah, I
question
think
make sense? Because that was very
yes,
long.
yes. No, it's actually very good, and I think there are different aspects to that. So normally, if you want the companies or manufacturing industry to do something, there are different pathways. One of them is that as a customer, we choose those product, or we go and demand that change. But another thing is through the policies and from the government initiatives. So normally when, for example, the approach of the companies, for example, in different part of the world is different. Same, for example, international company will deal with their material and waste differently in Japan, in Australia, in Europe, or in US, because of the government policies. So the government policies is very important because they can demand the companies to recycle that. But again, the policies from the government, when it's happening, it's through us as a people that electing those governments. So again, coming back to us. So if we demand, for example, those people that we are electing and the government, to that we need to take care of their environment or take care of our future, then they have to put the policies, and then the companies or manufacturing companies follow those policies and recycle that. So one of the areas that nowadays is also actively is happening is through the, for example, some initiatives that they call it as a product stewardship. So through that, the manufacturing companies is actually adding a small percentage of the money into the product when they are selling. And we as a customer, when we buy that product, we are actually paying for the recycling of that product at the end of the life.
Mm.
And that company, because collecting the company collecting this money, so they actually coming, for example, putting in place the way that for the collection of the product, recycling of that, and it start happening, for example, for the um, uh, tire of the cars or from the mattresses. So these things is start to happening, but for the big items, big and bulky items, because it's easier to collect them. Or recently, for example, in Australia, it's happening for the uh, bottles, for example, the drink bottles, cans, and everything. So when a customer buy the product, they add, for example, additional 10 cent to that. But when the customer bring back the bottles and bring back the cans, they reimburse that 10 cent to them. So it's customer willing to take those products to the recycling centers, and those manufacturing companies also willing to put the money to recycle them. So all these things, it's happening and creating, it is a start to happening, but the issue is the scale is not big enough. And especially with the issue that we are at, it is not that big. So it's happening as small things, for example, one company is start to recycling or another one, but not in the biggest scale. And that's where our role is coming as a customer, because when we are buying the product, if for example now you go to a shopping center or supermarket, you can see some of the product they written is plant-based polymer, or it's written that, for example, is from recycled polymer. But when you take that product and look at it in a small print, they mention only 20% of it's from, for example, plant-based, or only 20% of it is recycled. So that's the issue. There is, and they call it as a greenwashing. So it's a lot of greenwashing is happening. And I think we as a customer, we need to make sure that if we are going to pay extra, for example, for a recycled product or for plant-based, we make sure that is actually is happening, not only 10% of it or 20% of it. And at the same time, I think there need to be more policies and government legislation that actually force these companies to put correct labeling or correct information in their product. So from both sides need to be more activation in that.
You know, one thing that you said shocked me was that when you actually check these plant products, they're not completely plant-based. And that's interesting because I've never taken the time to check myself. I just presume when I see the label, okay, it's plant-based, so it is. And that's another
Yeah, maybe some of them, but maybe some of them is actually is. But For sometimes, because I'm mostly interested, so sometimes I look at them and they mention the big label that it is, but when you look at it, it's just, for example, a small percentage of it. Or they use, for example, other terminology. For example, they use it is biodegradable, for example, polymer or something like that. So
Mm,
always they're trying to change the labeling to show that it's actually a good product. But when you dig deeper, you find that it's not. It's actually damaging more. Yeah, so let me just also give you one more information in that, so you can see some of this product is actually more harmful. If you take two polymeric product, for example, two shampoo bottle.
mhm,
So these two shampoo bottles, one of them is normal polymer, for example, and some of them is putting that it is, for example, biodegradable polymer. But it's not actually biodegradable. It's actually a polymer that can be degrade into the smaller polymer. So if both of these bottles going to the landfill in the waste, that
mhm,
one which is the normal polymer is actually holding its shape for the longer time. But the other one, which is they put it as a biodegradable, is actually a start to degrade into the microplastics. So, and those microplastics is actually harming more compared to the normal plastic, because wash away by water, or it's go by the wind, and it's go to the uh, animals life and everything. So if you if there is not actual biodegradable polymer, is actually harming the planet more compared to the normal polymer.
oh God. You see, these are almost like industry secrets that many people cannot see through, because we've learned a lot today about the impact that we have as people, and actually trying to demand proper um, regulations and recycling from the companies that we invest in, and also buying the correct products. One thing that you mentioned with plant-based products that I do remember is that sometimes they say they're made out of vegetables, but they're not. A lot of the industry is based on growing mushrooms, like just mass producing the different types of fungi, and then making it into a burger, a plant-based burger and the rest of it, which is another problem in and of itself. And as you can imagine, going back to Dr. Farshid's point of biodegradable polymers, if they're going to end up in your water anyway, what's the point of buying into the buzzword of sustainability and things being biodegradable if it's going to poison you at the end of the day? You're better off just buying something that isn't sustainable and being safe, really. So, yes, those were my questions. And what I wanted to do before I go to the questions of everyone on this line is to just quickly get your opinion on investing in soil in particular. So whether it's actually buying land or not just campaigns such as saving soil, but is there any other way that we can um, contribute to actually save what exists now and to prevent the degradation from going on, whether it's tomorrow or next year?
Yeah, I think very the easiest way is that. So I'm borrowing this from the Safe Soul movement, because it's actually very beautiful movement that is happening. So it, they're mentioning that every one of us, we have the voice, and that voice we can change the um, policy of the country. So the soil. If we, for example, we go and buy a small piece of the land and preserve it, or if we, for example, do in our own farm and grow it organically, it doesn't change the big picture. So now we are in the stage that we have to change the big picture, because if we continue this as it is, the population is increasing, but at the same time, our capacity of producing food is decreasing. So it means that in the near future, we have an issue of the supply of the food, and we will have a lot of world hunger. So
Mm,
I think we have to start to mentioning that what is the solution. And the solution is very simple. The solution is we need to maintain the organic content in the soil, and that's happening just, for example, when the farming is for example, cropping and making, for example, the corn on everything. Those eatable parts, they of course they will sell, but the other component of it need to go back to the soil, because that's the organic content that it's maintained the life of the soil. So it actually doesn't cost much, it doesn't change everything, and it's much easier. And these things is only will happen if the governments put the legislation and put the incentive, and for example say that to the farmers that for if you do this, we for example help you to in some extent. And
Mm,
we as individuals, we can ask, or for example representative in the government, we can ask, or councillors, we can ask, or local representative, that this is the issue for the future, and we want to make sure that it's happening. We want to make sure that our next generation, they have the food to eat. And I think it's very important to whoever is listening, or in this listening to this talk, that please just go to this website savesol.org and look for yourself, look at it, look what they are doing. And if you are interested in that, please join that movement, because this movement is global movement. So it's not for one company or things. It's actually a people's movement, and there is not one company getting incentive or getting money. It's just your voice and your time to help to preserve the soil for the future.
exactly. Thank you so much for your time and your presentation. And what I would like to do now is just for anyone who has any questions, for them to post it on the chat. And now I'm just going to read through what some people have said during our conversation. And most of this is from our dear friend Hisham, who has spoken about microplastics, saying that it's in everything and everywhere, destroying our systems, and it's causing severe health damage. Another thing I'd like to read from his comments is the issue that is most important relative to the critical natural resource we call soil is what human beings put into it, whether it's in the activities to make money from it or the activities to dispose of what we do not want and call waste or trash or garbage. Both activities need to be addressed. Yeah, I know it's not specifically a question, but then maybe it's something interesting we can talk about. And maybe as a last topic, do you think there should be a redefinition of what is considered waste? Because I know, let's say Korean natural farming, they use waste rice and they plant it underneath the tree to create good bacteria that they can now distribute as a type of fertilizer to help grow a tree of that specific species. So that's how they reuse their waste. But I don't know if there's any other waste materials that currently exist that we're not really thinking about. And do you know any that you could suggest?
Yeah, it's basically, I think everything that we call it as a waste is actually is not the waste, is a resource. Yeah. For example,
Mm,
anything you imagine. Let's just consider one water bottle that everybody has used. So the plastic of it is actually good quality plastic,
mm,
but as a function of the product, it's reached to the end of the life. So that water bottle reached to the end of the life as a water bottle. But the polymer itself is actually a good quality polymer, and it can last long. And
mm,
if we we look at every waste like that, for example, a can of the coca is good quality aluminum. It's reached to the end of life as a can of the coke, but it
mm,
has the good quality material. So if you look at them like that, then we can either reuse them or repurpose them or reform them. For example, a textile, a shirt that we are wearing. If
Hmm.
it reached to the end of the life as a shirt, we cannot wear it anymore. But the fibers and the textile itself is actually good quality fibers. So we can reform them to produce a product, for example, acoustic for building application. So,
Yeah,
or for example, making the furniture out of it. So in that sense, we are keeping the material, but reform the product to another thing. So normally when I talk or I present, I put this challenge to everybody that for the next 24 hours, when you have any material, anything that you want to put it into the trash as a waste, just pause for another 5 seconds and look at it and see if there is any other application for that, or it is actually need to go to the trash, or look at it if there is that material has another benefit or not. So in this way, we can change the way that we are looking at the waste, and instead of calling it the waste, we can call it as a resource. But for example, waste coming from one company can be resource for producing product for another company,
yeah,
similar to example that you mentioned. So the waste from the house, from the rice farming is a waste because they remove the rice, the rest is the waste, but it's actually beneficial for the tree for another farming. So the same happening in the world of the art synthesis material like plastics, textile, polymer, and everything else.
exactly. And um, one thing I'd even like to add on to your point, which is amazing. By the way, I do love the fact that you said products reach the end of its use as that particular thing, not that it's useless altogether. So a can of Coke it's reached the end of its use as a can of Coke, but of course it can be made into something else. And this is part of the reason why I urge for people to really understand what products around them can be used for. And this especially goes for deforestation as well. I don't know if you guys can even imagine how many trees we could save if we decided to prune branches instead and know enough about a tree species to see what we could use it for. Now, I don't know the scientific name for this, but in Nigeria, we have a specific tree where once you prune the branches, you can soak it and then you can use it as a sponge to shower with. Once you finish soaking the wood, it will turn into almost a sponge and you can use that to shower. Now, it's a type of branch that is commonly used as a vine to design people's gardens. So you can imagine something that could be used for vines for 2 or 3 years can now be soaked and then used as a sponge instead.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Exactly. So,
Thank you for sharing it. Yeah.
and thank you for sharing your points. And I think one thing we've really learned from you today is to just give everything a critical eye instead of presuming that we have to go the same journey down environmentalism or down being resourceful or recycling. We can actually think about the uses we have for them currently and what they could potentially be, and also see ourselves as advocates for the earth and how we can change the overall view. And like I've mentioned before, stop putting so much focus on what we do as individuals and seeing how the attitude towards climate change and towards waste management is evolving. So, yes, thank you. I think that's all. I haven't gotten any questions apart from Chris saying, how healthy is global soil? I know we mentioned that there's only 1% organic matter in Australian soil, but do you know for global soil before we finish?
I think I don't have the exact numbers, but if you look at this website that was mentioned, they have the good numbers from all over the world. That, for example, in US, Europe, Africa, Asia. So everywhere they have the data in there. And the bad news is everywhere is below the 3% standard. So it's actually
Wow.
we have damage only in some part of the Europe which has the very good land, they are more than 3%. But every other where is actually below 3%, which is the very bad situation.
Well, that is a very negative note to leave on, but then it's something that we really ponder on. If most of the world has degraded soil, I just want everyone to think about how we can solve that and move forward. And just start from today. Start with this 24-hour challenge of how we can recycle something today that surrounds us that we were going to throw away in the bin. So yes, I want to thank you everyone for coming and listening. And thank you, Dr. Farshid, for speaking on this topic.
No, thank you very much for having me.
This has been very much expository for every one of us, and I really thank you, Marianne, for anchoring this, and Dr. Farshid for giving this perspective of investing in soil. And this is very, very important for us all to know that one of the best ways we can invest, look at what Dr. Farshid said, is to get back what the organic content of the soil. So if you can do this, we can be able to protect our soil from degradation. If you go across the Sahel region in parts of West Africa, you can see desert encroachment coming. And the government actually launched this project called the Great Dreamworks project, which is there to restore back and push back the certification. And I know those also in North Africa also doing that, also restore back this whole thing. And it all boils down on getting back what the organic content of the soil. So this is very important for us. And if there is nothing else we can get from here, we should get this done. So there are several ways we can do this through composting our trash, through composting our waste. Actually, there is nothing waste in nature. Nature has given us this whole beautiful color. When we pick our oranges in Africa here, we throw that away. So keep it as something we can use to get back the fertility of our soil. And things like plastic, we should find ways to do what? To be able to recycle our plastic and not get them to the soil to damage and degrade our soil. So it's been an interesting one, and on behalf of the Green Promise Initiative team, we really thank you so much, Dr. Farshid, for joining us, everyone who came around. And this is the website of the Green Promise Initiative. I know there could be some flaws in it. But the thing there is that this is our first webinar, and I know that subsequent ones actually be a very great one. And it's really lovely to have Rashid and Marianne to anchor our first webinar. We are really happy. So I want to thank everyone joining us from Morocco, joining us from Zambia. I can see from Nigeria here, from Liberia, from America, from the UK, and all that. So thank you for joining us, and have a nice day. Remember, just what we have in common, so we have to protect it. And one of the best ways of protecting the earth is to do what? Protect the soil. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.